Welcome back to the Witching Hour Wagon. In this episode, we have 5 real terrifying forest and deep woods stories. So sit back and enjoy. Number 1. Hauntings at the camp. When I was younger, back in the 1980s, I was hired to drive an older native man into the nearby town. When we were done, I drove him back home. Along the way, we encountered an old acquaintance of his. They were talking about their younger times, and I couldn't help but overhear their conversation. My passenger told his friend about the time his father, the passenger's father, was working on a logging crew. This was about the 1930s or so. The story goes like this. The workers will leave camp every morning and go to the job site and cut down trees all day. Then they would haul them back to the camp for loading. The camp itself was located deep in the bush miles from the nearest town, accessible only by a rough logging road. The camp used a generator for power, and it used diesel fuel. This came in 3 55-gallon drums. One day after work, they returned to camp to find it had been ransacked. Everything was rummaged through and spilled out. They thought it must have been a bear, since bears were common in that area. They cleaned up as best as they could and went to sleep. The next day, while at the job site, they heard a commotion at the camp. They sent some men to investigate, while the rest kept working. The men found the camp in disarray again. They cleaned up again and returned to work. Later, they all returned to camp and called it a night. The next day, before leaving for work, they tied up the supplies higher up in the trees for safety. If I remember correctly, my passenger said that his father's crew heard yelling and screaming throughout the day, like a woman screaming. Nobody wanted to go investigate because they were miles from the nearest town, and that couldn't be a woman. When they returned to camp, they found the food supplies had been ransacked again, but the bags were intact. That meant whoever was stealing their things had to have untied the bags. Bears don't untie knots. They would simply rip the bags open. Furthermore, the bags were tied up 10 feet off the ground. That week, the supply train came in and dropped off supplies. Some of the supplies were new fuel drums for the generator. The next day, as before, while at work, they found the camp torn through again. This time, they found the oil drums had been thrown about 30 feet away and had hit the ground so hard they dug deeply into the soft earth. This was the last straw for several of the men, and they wanted to walk out of the woods. Some would stay only if the company provided armed security. At this point, my passenger's friend got called away, and I never did hear the end of the story. I didn't have the nerve to ask him about it either. I think about it from time to time, because it apparently happened near Bisid, Manitoba, near where I live. Over the years, there have been strange sightings in the area, and I wonder, whatever was haunting their camp, is this thing still out there? Number 2. The glowing orbs. The user and their family were camping on a lake in central Texas. On the first night, they were playing Pictionary by the campfire when they saw a light fly over the lake. For a moment, They didn't think much of it, and instead continued the game. Then another went by at the same speed, following the exact same trajectory as the first. They were reddish yellow orbs with no sound coming from them. After about 15 of the orbs went by, a faster, smaller, white one came in behind the rest. Then they were all gone. Not much was said about the event for the rest of the trip, but when they returned home, their mother looked up what the lights could have been. She discovered that people in a town a few miles from where they had been camping also reported seeing the lights. No one had an explanation for what they were. Number 3. 3 knocks. The user and their girlfriend were sitting in their car that was parked at a rest area, having something to eat after visiting the renowned Mount St. Helens. It was raining, so the windows were fogged, and thanks to the approaching nightfall, it was getting dark. The couple was minding their own business when suddenly there was a series of 3 knocks on their driver's side window. They were both startled. There was no one else in the parking lot. Even more terrifyingly, the driver's side of the car was overlooking an embankment. They rolled down their window and looked out, but saw no one. This was enough to thoroughly creep them out. They left immediately. Later, they read a park flyer that a man had died there during the eruption. Ever since, they have been wondering if the knocks on the car door were that man's ghost, trying desperately to be saved. Number 4. Their dog knew something was wrong. The user was camping in Big Sur, California, with one of their best friends one weekend. They almost had the entire site to themselves and chose a campsite about half a mile from the ocean, in a large open field surrounded by a forest. They spent that evening sitting around the campfire telling stories. Afterwards, the two climbed into their tent and fell asleep easily. Around 1 in the morning, something startled their dog. She is usually very calm and used to being in the woods, but this time she was yanking at the leash, trying to get away. She pulled so hard that her harness snapped and she bolted across the field. The user chased after her into the forest, where they eventually found her curled in a random clearing. They picked her up and carried her back to the campsite. They all hid inside the tent, but the dog refused to lay down with her people. Her ears were up, and she was staring intensely at the tent wall. At this point, the user and their friend were also on edge. The dog's behavior didn't make sense. Then they heard the cackling, a high-pitched laughter coming from outside their tent. They were so scared they could hardly breathe. Then screams followed the laughing. They thought it could have been wolves or a coyote killing their prey, but it sounded far too human. Their car was parked too far for them to bolt for it, so they just listened to the freakish laughter until it faded away. Number 5. What do you do after stumbling on a clan rally? While camping in the Manistee National Forest in Michigan, the user saw something they will never be able to forget. That year, they had decided to try a new spot on the river that had better access for fishing and kayaking. They were miles from the nearest town, so the odds of running into anyone else were slim. On their first day, they set up their tents and spent the afternoon by the river. Before returning to camp in the evening, they were sitting around their fire when they noticed another massive fire glowing through the trees about 300 yards away. Then the chanting began. When the user got a closer look, they realized it was actually a burning cross. 5 minutes into the chanting, gunfire started. The user guessed there were at least 10 different guns going off, followed by yells about white power. Based on the level of the noise, they thought there had to have been at least 20 people. They packed up what they could carry and got out of the camp as quickly as they could. This is it for today's episode of the Witching Hour Wagon. Let us know in the comments below which one was your favorite. And if you liked the video, press that like button, share the video, subscribe to the channel to get more of these creepy stories. Also, if you have your own scary story, please send it to the email below. Thanks for tuning in. Be wary and take care, because something wicked is always on its way.